This little maple tree died last summer, and it's time to cut it down. Now, I'm hoping there's still some good wood in this tree that I can make some lures out of. But right now, I'm just focusing on dropping this thing right on my GoPro. Most of this stuff is going to end up as firewood, so I'll cut it up into small pieces and haul it off. Everything except for this one piece right here. This one will mill down to make it into lures, but first it's got to be lure size. Alright, I'm going to have to oven dry that wood, probably overnight. But in the meantime, let me explain to you what it is I'm going to use it for. This weird looking lure is the very first original design that I ever came up with, probably 9, maybe 10 years ago. It's this very thin, elongated, multi-part crankbait with a bib. Now, when I made this way back when, it didn't work. It was a complete failure. I really liked the way it looked, but it really didn't work. For some reason, I found it impossible to tune it. It wouldn't spin or anything, but it just wouldn't run straight, ever. And it had a very weird and unnatural action. So the challenge today is to take an old design that really never worked and make it work. We'll probably have to make a couple of semi-substantial changes to the body, but the key here is to have a successful lure, and not just a lure that looks kind of cool. And if you're new to the channel, my name's Franco. I'm a professional engineer, a lure designer and lure maker, and an avid fisherman. And I make these videos so that I can share some of the things I've learned and inject a little bit of physics and engineering to the art of lure making. So the one biggest flaw in this lure design is the combination of 4 joints combined with a bib. Now, I didn't cover this in the crankbait masterclass, but anytime you get beyond 1 or 2 body joints with a lipped crankbait, you end up having an unsynchronized body action. In other words, a body action that doesn't conform with what the head is doing. With 1 joint, what you end up with is the head moving and the second section just following behind, about a half a cycle behind the head oscillation. Once you add another section, that third piece is visually out of sync with the other 2. Add another piece and the lure really moves with a very unnatural look, sort of dynamic chaos. And that causes other problems with keeping the lure tuned. So we're going to have to make some change. I could either reduce the joints or get rid of the bib. Now, if I get rid of the bib, I'm actually changing the lure completely. It no longer is a crankbait, it would just be a swim bait. So I think that would be cheating a little bit. I'm going to reduce the joints. And we'll probably move this one so it's closer to being 2 equal pieces. We'll leave a tail as its own segment. It'll still be a little bit wonky, but I think we can make it work. All right, there's our drawing transferred onto the piece of wood, and I've gone ahead and put the dimensions of the segments so that you guys can have them. The tail I won't cut out of this wood. I'll cut that out of a thinner piece of wood to make it a little easier on myself. While I still have square sides, I'm going to go ahead and mark out where my dive bib slot is going to be, just so I know I have it square across the face. And in the end, I'll widen it just a little bit, so I'm sure the bib will fit. Before I sketch in the taper of the top of the body, I'm going to go ahead and just put a center line in. And I'll flip over the body just to be sure that I've got it properly measured for the center. So really the only controlling point for this sketch is the wide point. And I want that just behind the center of the section. Right at the center will be okay, but I want to push it just behind that center point. So I'll just sort of hand sketch this thing, and it takes me a couple of tries. All right, now I've got some working lines. I can go out to the belt sander and get this thing shaped from front to back, and then round it off at the tops, tapered down a little narrower at the bottom, and round it off as well. All right, so we're gotten pretty close to the final shape. Still needs some work as far as hand sanding, but I've got the general shape, the taper, and good symmetry all the way through. So I've gone ahead and sanded it a little bit, but I'm finding that it still has some moisture in it, and it won't sand really cleanly unless I get all the moisture out. So I'm going to stick it back in the oven, and along with it I'll put the little block that we're going to use to find the density. And that goes in at about 150 degrees. So it's taken a little more than I figured to get this thing dry. And the way I'm evaluating if it's dry or not is that every time I pull it out of the oven, which I leave it in there for like 45 minutes, I weigh it, and I've been writing down the weights. It started off at 16.59, dropped to 15.13, and then 14.70, and now it's at 14.65. So basically it's dry. It's not really dropping anything substantially, so this guy's dry and ready to final sand. So now comes the time when I start to question my original design. I like the look of the elongated body, but having all these segments, it's going to end up with a really funky kind of action with this lure. So I'm kind of reconsidering what I'm doing here, and I'm reconsidering having a tail as a separate segment. I think it's going to look a little bit too much like a marionette. Too many joints. I'm thinking maybe I'll go with one of these brush fiber tails that I used on this one. This way we'll still have two joints, not just one, but the tail won't be out there dangling. I certainly don't want this to end up a dud again, so I'm going to play it safe. And I'm just going to cut a slot in that last piece and put in those fibers for a tail. But we'll stick to the original dimensions of those segments, so this is going to be right at 2.5 and then 1.5 to the last cut. And I'll cut the slot in the tail while it's still together and it's easy to hold on to. Whenever you cut through a hand-carved lure, that's the real test of symmetry. Pretty happy with that. It's not perfect, but it's pretty doggone close. That's pretty good. All right, now that we've got our hinge arrangement kind of designed, where we've got the knuckle and socket, the way that works is that I put a screw in eye, sticks out into a slot, and then there's a pin that runs through it. So what I'm going to do next is take the Dremel, the same way I cut this slot for the tail, and cut slots in to the two pieces for the hinge eyes. And while I'm at it, I'll cut a slot in so I can put in the fin. As usual, I'm making my lure hardware out of this stainless leader wire. This is 174 pound test, number 12 wire. And I like to use these safety wire twist pliers to make my twist eyes. And I'll do both hook hangers and the tie-in eye with this. And just as a reminder, if you're interested in any of the material or tools I use on this stuff, I try to find good links for them on Amazon and put them into my Amazon store. So I'll cut them to the proper size and glue them in with some 2-part epoxy. Great, I just broke the tip off this little bit inside the lure, and I gotta figure out a way to dig that out. There's always something that gives you a little more challenge than you expected. There it goes. I had to cut a slot in it, get it out, so now I gotta refill that slot and re-drill the hole. All right, now I need to widen this slot so that my Lexan bib will fit in there. Looks like the lip will fit in there perfect. All right, so I've got to cut this pin. This is going to be my hinge pin. I've got to cut it to size. All right, perfect. I'll weigh all the parts of the body, and these two little segments have their pins in them. And then all the hardware, the two hinge eyes, the hooks and split rings, and the dive bib. and we've got 19.07. I've already taken the block that I cut off there of the same wood, and I've calculated the density of this block. It's 0.575 grams per cubic centimeter. I weighed the lure, it was 13.8 grams. That's with no hardware, just the wood. And I divided it by the density of the wood, and I get 24 grams. That's the absolute maximum amount of weight that lure should weigh before it starts to sink. I don't want it to sink. So I'm gonna have it weigh right at about 21 grams so that it sits well in the water, but it doesn't sink. I don't want it to be a bobber, but I don't want it to start to sink. Let's see what this little split shot will do. I think it's about 2 grams. Okay, 21.37 grams. I think that's perfect. And I think that's got it. I'll be able to fill that and cover the lead pretty well. And I'll do that with just a little bit of UV resin, just stacking it slowly and hitting it with the UV light. And after 2 layers, it's hard, pretty glossy, and it's ready to be sanded flush. Sorry about the background noise, the AC is on. This screw-in eye that's going to be my hinge eye, I'm just going to screw in with a couple of drops of crazy glue on it. I've never had a problem with that. It holds really well. Alright, so before I left last night, I took all 3 pieces, I painted them black, and I gave them a good clear coat to give them a nice shiny finish. And I did that because I planned to do a spray chrome finish on these things. So yeah, we're ready to paint. But before we paint, it's time for the question of the week. And that's where I take questions out of the comments and answer them here in a video. Now my intention is to answer questions from subscribers, but I'm not such a hard ass that I'm looking to see if you're a subscriber. But if you're asking for questions and asking for help, throw me a bone and subscribe and drop some likes on some videos. Alright, so the question has to do with swim baits. I've had a few questions about why people's swim baits just won't swim. Either they want to roll or they just pull straight and they won't swim. It's pretty easy to design and build a lure that pulls straight. And it has everything to do with turbulence and how the mechanics of your hinges translates the motion through the body. First, let's talk about the appropriate shape that will give you plenty of turbulence over your joints to get that motion. This is not a good swim bait shape. This is almost a perfect foil. This is a really what they call a clean shape. It doesn't cause much turbulence. It's meant to flow really smoothly through air or water. What you want is a shape that is more nearly symmetric. In other words, the wide point should be almost at the center of the lure. I'm about to draw it here. And not near the head. And the entry point should be relatively narrow, so you have a shape that's more like that. It can be a little less symmetric and you can do a little stylizing of your own, but this is a shape that will work relatively well. And you want to have your first joint at least 25% back. I prefer closer to 30 or 33%. So my largest joint is the head. And then I like to have my pieces diminishing in size as I go back. It tends to give it a more fluid motion. So the next step is you need to look at the hinge that you're using, the style of hinge. Now what I recommend is that you go back through my videos. I'll go ahead and link a playlist in the description so you can go through and watch them. Watch the video where I developed this hinge. This is a hinge I call the power hinge, and it's what I'm using here. This is just sort of a miniaturized power hinge. It's a plate coming out of the forward piece going into a slot with a pin going through it. And what this hinge arrangement does is it takes the energy from the turbulence and pushes it back towards the head. It's kind of a weird thing to imagine, but as this tail moves, it wants to reflect that motion back up towards the head of the lure, giving the lure a much more pronounced swimming action. And this is the kind of hinge I use on everything I make, even if it's just slightly tweaked and made a little smaller. Now, a few of you have pointed out that there's a major lure manufacturer that have co-opted my design, and they're not calling it a power hinge, but they're calling it something close to that. And yeah, I noticed it, and yeah, I don't know, maybe they came up with it on their own, maybe they watched my video. Anyway, try these changes and watch the videos, I think it'll help. All right, I'm gonna make the tail fin out of this disposable little brush. And first thing I'll do is open it up and pull the brush right out of there. All right, so I've got the brush slug out of the handle. And then what I like to do is to thin it out a little bit. I don't want all of it. So I take about 25%, maybe a little more. And this end is actually a little ball of glue. So I'm gonna grab that ball of glue with a pair of pliers, just on the glue, and then I'll squeeze. And you can see how it spreads the fiber, turns it into a fan. And I'll just take this fan and put it on my tape on the sticky side. This way it stays that way. And I'll fold the tape over on it so it's fully sandwiched in. And I've outlined the fan so you guys can see it. All you have to do is draw the tail fin shape that you like and then cut it out. Leave the tape on for now and then we'll glue it into the tail piece of the lure. Alright, so I'm making a small fin, so that's about the shape I want. And it's not a bad idea to hold it up to your tail section and see what it's going to look like. I think that's going to be pretty good. And then it's a matter of just cutting it out. Now there's always a little bit of trimming at the end anyway, so don't get too fussy about how close you follow your lines. Now I want to peel back the tape at the root of the tail so I can glue it in. So here it is with the glue ball exposed and inserted into the little slot. All I got to do is glue it in there with some UV resin. And then I'll wrap it with a little more tape just to keep it safe from the rest of the paint job. And I'm just going to put a little bead of UV right around the edge. And my hands are shaking from all the coffee I had this morning. I need to cut back. And that bead of resin will hold that together. All right, there it is. Let's start putting this thing together. All right, before you put it together, be sure you clean all your hardware. You're gonna slide the pin in, poke it down so it's below the surface a little bit. And then I'm just putting just a tiny drop, man, my hands are shaking. Just a tiny drop of UV resin just to seal it and of course keep it from wiggling out. And I'm not sure how well the camera's gonna pick that up. I've wiped it down with some alcohol and it's ready for the first step. I'm going to use the last little bit of the Spastics paint that I have. I think this shape is screaming for a mackerel paint job. I think that's what I'm going to go with. First, let's get it a nice shiny chrome. So I thought I had some left of this stuff, but it dried up, so no fear. Our backup is the Molotov stuff. And this stuff really does look like Quicksilver. I gotta admit, this thing puts a pretty nice mirror finish on there. You can see my finger in there, and even me in the background. Alright, so I just put a couple of coats of Minwax polyacrylic to seal the paint and protect it. I still need to put the bib on and the eyes on. I'm going to go with these blue lizard eyes. I think it looks pretty wicked. Yeah, that'll do. And now for the bib, I'm just going to put a little bit of UV resin in the vase. If it squeezes out a little bit, it doesn't matter. It looks pretty good. I'll put a little extra on the edges, and then I'll set it with the UV light. And what's good is the light will travel right through this Lexan and down into that crevice and set the stuff that's down inside. All right, that's looking pretty good. Can't wait to see what it looks like in the water. I got it on my lure holder. Now I'm going to give it a very careful clear coat, making sure I get a good coat on all the big spots and make sure very little gets inside these joints. All right, I'm going to give it a couple hours in here and then we'll take it to the lake. All right, it's been a couple hours. I think that's enough. Looks pretty nice. All right, so all I got to do is put the hooks on. Well, and I've got to take the tape off the tail too. And then we'll drop it in the little test tank and see how it sets. That fin looks really nice. All right, let's put it in the tank. I got to say, it came out looking really nice. Let's see what it looks like in the water. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. The head of the lure is well under the water, but it doesn't act like a bobber. I'm tucked into a little corner because it's really blowing out in the middle of the lake. Let's go ahead and throw this in the water. I was so excited I didn't even go down to my own dock. All right, here it is. First time in the lake. Let's see if it swims at all. Oh my God. Look at that. It just barely wiggles. Oh, this lure design is somehow destined to be a dud. Let's see if it's any different when it's a little further out there. It's just barely wiggles. It's just like barely wiggles. All right, let's try tweaking this thing down closer to the bib. All right, before we completely give up, I made a little bit of a tweak to the tie-on eye, and I think I've got it actually working. It is actually swimming and swimming straight. All right, before we do the underwater shots, let me show you what I did to the tie-on eye. Hopefully you can see how I squished it down, and that basically elongates it and puts the tie position just a little farther forward, and that makes a big difference on any lure. Now let's see what it does underwater. So glad I got this to actually work. Thanks for watching, everybody. This was a bit of a challenge. Don't forget to subscribe and leave any questions you have in the comments. You might be the next question of the week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. All right, so the question is, what is the freaking question? I forgot.